Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our virtual seminar. This is Africa Table at Stanford. I'm going to hand over to our Associate Director, Dr. Robin Chapdelaine, to introduce our speaker today. Thanks for being with us, and apologies that we're running a little bit late.
Welcome, everybody. And again, thank you for your patience as we dealt with some technical difficulties. I'd like to introduce Dr. Toby Green, who is a fellow of the British Academy and professor of pre-colonial and Lusophone African history and culture at King's College London. His books include the award-winning A Fistful of Shells. He is a member of the advisory board of the Lagos-based Global Africa Institute and was also an advisory member for the Amilcar Cabral Centenary Conference of 2024. Green has worked on curriculum change in the teaching of African history, both in the UK and in West Africa, and has been a member of the UK's government's Model History Curriculum Advisory Group. Welcome, Dr. Green.
Well, thank you very, very much, and thank you very much first for the invitation, Robin and Joel. I'm going to share my PowerPoint. There we go. And my apologies. The technical difficulties are mine alone, and so I apologize to everybody. I didn't realize that the time change had happened already in the US. It happens over here 1 week later. So my apologies for that, everybody, and for your patience and for bearing with us. So I'm going to I'm going to talk through the historical approach I've taken in writing The Heretic of Cacheu, which came out in October last year, and really as a kind of way of thinking about, first of all, how I wrote the book, but also I think more to the point, perhaps for a discussion like this, what the methods involved might allow us to think about historical methods at this point in time when things are changing so very rapidly, of course, technologically, and what that might mean in terms of the historical method when it comes to researching Africa's a more distant past, shall we say, as I have done in this book, dealing with the 17th century. And so hopefully that will allow us to have a kind of methodological discussion, which will be quite interesting from whatever perspective or period or location people are interested in discussing. Just to explore, I thought what I would do in this presentation is focus on elements which I brought out in this article in the Politics and Rights Review journal last year. I think it came out in September, which was called Microhistories in the African Past, and really thinking about the microhistorical approach as a way of reflecting on some of the challenges that face, I think, the historians in general, and I think maybe historians of the African continent in particular, when it comes to the current research landscape, particularly because of the continuing way, of course, in which new methods may continue to exclude aspects of the past and perspectives and approaches from that past, which are harder to include within some data-driven approaches. So how does the microhistorical help us to reflect on that? So firstly, just quickly, the region that the book I researched is set in, which is the region of today is Guinea-Bissau. And it's important to bear in mind that this, although this is a contemporary map, maybe that in a way is a bit more helpful to discuss some of the aspects which need to be borne in mind here, which is that this is very much a riverine region of West Africa, and this is quite important in thinking how the book is set, because although the book is in the sense in the tradition of Donald Wright perhaps and his work on Numi from the Gambia, so same kind of region and time period, focused on Cacheu and its hinterland. That hinterland is quite big because the creeks allowed in the rainy season, and still do in fact, travel from Cacheu, which is just to the north of Bissau on the map there, as you see, near to the border with Senegal, up to the Gambia River, and in fact quite far up the Gambia River. So this is quite a broad hinterland, and therefore a broad region that the book is engaging with. Although it is also a work which looks at a particular spatial area, an urban settlement in Cacheu. So the trials which I used, the sources which I used, firstly the written sources which I'll just talk through, Inquisition trials, and obviously those have pros and cons, which we can talk about. The pros are the enormous amount of detail in them, which I'll talk through in a bit, and the level of detail which allows from such a long time ago, which allows perhaps a different kind of approach towards social histories, and those kinds of approaches I'll talk through in a minute. And then these account books. So these account books from the quite well-known slave trader Manuel Bautista Perez, who moved to Lima and became one of the richest people there in the 1630s and was tried by the Inquisition. And in that trial, his account books from his time in Cacheu in the 1610s were impounded and still are held in the archive in Lima. And these are around about 800 or 900 folios of documents, which give an enormous amount of detail. So just I've put a couple of the folios up here, just so to give an example. But you can see I've on the left, written down the side there, are the place names mentioned in the document. So, for example, on the right-hand side, you'll see Porto de Cacheu at the bottom. And in fact, what that this is an entry of a ship captain trading in Cacheu on the Gambia River in 1617, and it's actually saying that he has given un frasco de vinho, a flagon of wine, that he was asked for so that he could invite para convidar a rainha, to invite the queen on board his vessel. So that gives just a snapshot of the kind of detail which is present in these documents, which is pretty unusual for the 17th century anywhere, in fact, and in West Africa. They're the only documents of their kind that I've come across. So benefits, as I said, the pros and cons of this. Benefits are these kind of details, which are pretty impossible to obtain in other kinds of historical records that we have. Written records, we might say. Obviously, in oral sources, some of these materials would come out too, and that's something that we can discuss. Extremely important for gender relations, actually, for gender history, for women's history. In fact, it becomes clear that a lot of the traders who who appear in these books are women, in fact. And then many details, which I'll talk through shortly. Of course, there are costs, and the costs are that these are documents which are not exactly African sources, although the Inquisition trials themselves are actually, many of the witnesses did not speak Portuguese, spoke in Creole, were African-born, many of mixed heritage, but not all of them. So there's a discussion that can be had about that. And then the question of how far these privilege written approaches to the African past rather than oral ones. Although, of course, some scholars, for example, Mauro Nobili and others, have pushed back against that framing of African historical discourse as predominantly oral in recent past through the work Mauro and others have done on the Sahel. So the methodology I tried to develop in the book was, as somebody said as somebody said to me, was to read the written record through the lens of oral methodologies, oral knowledge. For example, historical linguistics of different kinds, which inform a different understanding of the written text. So whereas often historians of this period might have done worked the other way round, examined and developed an understanding of the oral record through some written sources. I suppose in some ways I've tried to approach this in a different way. I've, as some of you will know, done quite a lot of work with oral sources in this region over many years, and so this allowed a different kind of reading, perhaps, of the written text. So that's the methodology which I've tried to develop, and perhaps in the rest of the presentation I'll try to think through where that might take us in terms of thinking about methods, data and microhistory at this moment in the historical discipline. So just another example of the kind of details which emerge, which I think, is just interesting in itself. So these two entries appear again in 1617. And the first one is of somebody called Ana Lopes, mulher que foi de Antonio Pinto. So that means the widow of somebody called Antonio Pinto. And the next one down is of Isabel de Miranda, que está em casa do mulher que foi de Antonio Pinto, who's living in the house of the widow of Antonio Pinto. So is living in the house of Ana Lopes, the person in the previous entry. So in other words, this is an all-female household. And that's the kind of detail which emerges in these documents, which is, as I say, one of the reasons why they are particularly important and relevant for gender history. So there's a broader context in which this sits: port histories of West Africa, Mariana Candido, Robin Law, Christine Mann, for example, and then the context of books which have drawn on Inquisition records to produce this kind of detailed social history, but not usually of West Africa. Some works have done so in terms of the diaspora, it is true, and we can think of some of those. But in general, this is thought of as a method which has been generally used for European social history. So I think one of the things which is perhaps interesting and maybe a bit provocative about the book is to try and bring that method through the lens of, as I say, a different reading of a text, through that interplay of oral and written knowledge and in the reading of the text to the West African context. So I'll perhaps try and speak for about another 10 minutes. I know we started late, so to give plenty of time for questions and discussions. So it might mean I have to speed through some of these. I suppose here I'm talking about what is the benefit of a historiographical focus on daily life. So particularly thinking about the microhistorical approach, as I say here. Firstly, as I say, challenging the idea that this is a methodology which could only be used to reconstruct detailed parts of European social history, or even Atlantic social history, which is where Inquisition records have generally been used. The detail of the book, the detail of these records also are really fascinating and moving when it comes to the histories of the emotions. One example I can give is when Crespina Perez talks about her interaction with healers, Jabacos, and how she had believed in their work and then ceased to believe in them. She said she stopped believing in it when, even though she consulted them to try and heal her daughter had died, and then her heart grew small, as she put it. So these kinds of details are important in rethinking different approaches into the past. And then these details also bring out in really fundamental ways the contexts of human trafficking, enslavement, both in Cacheu and across the Atlantic. And but the details also show how that sits within a much broader framework also of the history of African history of this town Cacheu in its past. So that's an important relationship which the book allows, and that focus on daily life allows to try and bring out. I've discussed gender before, so I think given that we're short on time, I'm going to perhaps move through that to think about some of the other themes that the book, this microhistorical approach, allows us to challenge and develop and engage with. Institutional economics. So we might not think that a microhistorical approach would enable us to reflect on institutional economics. But in fact, I would argue that the book does, because one of the things about it is it shows how the Inquisition, which is after all one of the most powerful institutions in the Atlantic world in this era, is through its trial of Crespina Perez, who's the wealthiest trader in Cacheu at this time, actually undermines and in fact destroys an aspect of an existing trading network. Others then step in and will work to rebuild that. But that forces us to ask, this idea that developing new institutions and strong institutions is a way to secure economic transformations of a positive kind, the question then becomes whose institutions? In fact, that sits quite nicely with the work of people like Acemoglu, Johnson and Robinson on these questions of institutions and how those began to change through this era of the early modern era. Wage labour and the early history of capitalism. I think that on the right there's a screenshot of an article I published a few years ago on the relationship between Africa and the history of capitalism and wage labour in Africa. And actually, one of the things we learned from the account books, which I think is really important, is that wage labour was the norm in Cacheu. In fact, it was completely the norm. We see that from the account books in many different examples. And actually, that would put Cacheu at an early stage in the history of wage labour and capital-intensive activity. And it would suggest, as a number of scholars like Inikuri, and we could also say Olufemi Taiwo, have argued that actually it was in the 19th century that this process of modernization was interrupted. And so I think this is an aspect of the book which is and of this approach, of the microhistorical approach of diving into the details, which allows it to try and engage with those themes. Health, I think, is a major theme of the book. It's the last chapter is called Living, Healing and Dying in Cacheu. And it's a theme which, again, the details from the book allows it to engage with. There's some well-known books which deal with those themes in both Africa and the diaspora. And really, what I try to do is build on Kalakana Noja's work on West Africa through this microhistorical example to show the relationship between empire, Portuguese Empire in this case, and the kind of ideological attack which this involved on West African ways of seeing the world, including the relationship between human subjects and the world around them, and that relationship to healing, and how this links to what you might call the long-term origins of more recent iterations of medical colonialism. So this the fact that the trial is and the details in it deal with somebody trying to heal their child, and the way in which they drew on Jabakos Guinean knowledge to do that, is an exemplar of and that details within that really relate to much of this literature on health in the early modern Atlantic world, and its relationship to other ways of seeing the world. So the book, I hope this, and I'm sorry it's been an abbreviated presentation, but I hope that this abbreviated presentation does give a sense of the many, many different themes which a microhistorical approach can help us to engage with. Of course, human trafficking and its impact on daily life and emotions in Cacheu is a central theme as well, which emerges from all of this. And the passage on the right, which is a short excerpt from the book, I think speaks more powerfully to this than anything. The witness said that our vicar has not spoken, which means that our vicar did not beat a slave with a stick, which means that he has not spoken. In other words, beating slaves was as commonplace as talking in Cacheu, and we can be grimly sure that daily beatings were as workaday as speech for the enslaved in Crispina and George's house in the 1660s. So these details speak, I think, perhaps to what I was just discussing earlier on in the presentation about the relationship between the microhistorical approach, history of the emotions, and also the way in which all of this is crystallizing in this period in the middle of the 17th century, when the sedimentation of European imperial power is beginning to attack other aspects of life in West Africa, including the perspective, the metaphysics, the relationship to the world, and how that is experienced through health. On the other hand, we also have details which show that there were maroon communities in Senegambia, communities of people who had escaped enslavement from Cacheu and were protected by the king of Bouger. So all of this, there's a vast amount here which shows, I think, the benefits of this approach that I've tried to take in the book. Time and space is another aspect, but we probably haven't got enough time for that. I think, to summarize all of that, what I'm trying to, I suppose, show in this presentation is how a microhistorical approach through the lens of an individual whose life history it's very unusual to be able to reconstruct in this detail, actually touches on many themes which historians and others concerned with Africa's past have been engaging with for a long time now. But the details within that um, produce a different kind of perspective, perhaps a perspective more sedimented in the historical experience of the historical subjects. And that's something in terms of the historical discipline as a whole, which I think is somewhat under threat through the continuing expansion of the data-driven world in which we live. So in order not to take any more time, I will stop there. I apologize again for the fact that this has been an abbreviated presentation, but I hope that the core of what I was trying to convey I've managed to do so. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that presentation. I will go ahead and start off we'll wait for more to come along. I'd like to know if you could expand more on the connection between gender, wealth, and jealousy as the story progresses through the book, and help us understand that a bit better.
That's a very fascinating and big question, Robin. Thank you. Yes. So there are many ways in which to answer that. The first being that, of course, the gender roles in Cacheu were quite distinct to those found in other parts of the in parts of the Portuguese Empire, and particularly in Lisbon. And this is an era where girls on the street in Lisbon are dressed in nuns' wimples because to be prepared for a life in the convent. And so to arrive in a setting like Cacheu for emissaries of the Portuguese Empire, like the Inquisition, and find a town where women run the marketplace, the richest trader is a woman, and that is extremely threatening in many different ways. And so I think there's a fear and a sense of, yes, an ideological challenge which that presents, as well as, of course, aspects of sexual jealousy, which I think the book also touches on. So the priest who actually begins the process which leads to the Inquisition trial being made is someone who seemed quite likely to have been suffering from sexual jealousy of Crispina Perez. And that therefore is at the basis of the reason why a book like this could be written, in fact, is those emotions and those and on the other hand, the fundamental basis of that from a kind of institutional point of view is therefore also the greed of the Portuguese Empire, of the metropole, its desire to impose a certain pattern of human relationships and material relationships, more importantly, to institutionalize a worldview. And that requires an ideological confrontation, which is what we see in the trial, through gender, but also through ideas about the world and human relationships in it. So yes, I think that you've really captured very beautifully there some of the tensions, interactions, and intersections, which kind of, as you say, roll on through the book.
I have a question, if I may. Thank you. That was really rich and fascinating, and I learned a huge deal. I wondered if you can expand on the last point you made about the sort of small microhistory versus the increasing turn towards extraordinarily large data sets, doubtless
Mm,
driven by technology that makes it easier to
mm.
process and interpret those data sets. Um, and I'm just curious to hear your thoughts on that and how these two methods possibly sit alongside each other or possibly are completely at odds with each other. I mean, it does strike me listening to you that this kind of granular attention to the inner life and to emotion is obviously something that you completely miss out with the large data set. But I'm curious to hear what you make of all of that.
Yeah, thank you, Joel. I mean, I think well, I mean, time will tell, won't it? Quite what this will mean. The artificial intelligence as a technology has only been with us for 3 or 4 years, and so we still don't know what it will mean in terms of. And I think at the moment I would see them act, and I think human beings have different ways of responding to technological transformations, and so there will probably be a bit of both. And in fact, in some ways, so to come back to your point about them sitting side by side, I think at the moment they are sitting side by side. In fact, curiously, one of the reviews of the book discussed the increasing trend towards microhistory, which that reviewer saw, and therefore that could be in some ways a kind of response to fears around uh, datafication kind of taking over. So, in fact, in some ways, maybe they do sit together, and obviously they're looking in a way at different aspects. I mean, but of course, there are databases which have obviously been around for quite a long time, and dealing with themes to do with enslavement and diaspora. We can all think of a number of them, and obviously a number of them have helped historians to develop some frameworks, including microhistory. So there's certainly a way in which the two can work together. At the same time, I am also concerned that the concern, if there's clearly, a lot of money driving data-driven projects, um, and that and the danger would be that predominance could, there's been a huge amount of work done in the field of African studies and diaspora studies in the last 60 or 70 years around ensuring that the subjectivity of African historical actors of the past is not obliterated as previous historical frameworks tried to do. And so the danger of a data-driven approach would be, for me, a turn towards a turn away from that process, and so that's obviously something which is a concern.
Thank you. We have a quick question from Richard Roberts. He says, many thanks for this fascinating and exciting presentation and your support for microhistory. Can you explain more fully your method of contextualizing Inquisition records and record books? I'm thinking here of Mariana Candido's use of court cases, especially for tracing women's agency. How in particular do you use oral histories to triangulate these 17th century sources?
Yeah, so thank you, Richard. Well, so I've done so some of the vocabulary of the sources is from languages from Senegambia and Guinea-Bissau, and some of the details around locations in the sources emerge in oral records, which I've been consulting for many years in the Gambia. So it's a sort of triangulation, I think you could say, between what's there, and then what other oral sources tell us about, for example, textile weaving, for example, monarchy. I mentioned a queen in one of the sources. So, for example, king lists and uh, micro microstate monarchies in different parts of that region. So there's a lot of different ways in which that is knowledge intersects with specific aspects of the trial. But I think more broadly, I would say, also is a way of reading the written text as well. So obviously, as we all know, when we read something, as I say to students, a source we look at is never a source on its own. It's actually, for a historian, it's a source plus you. And the source doesn't change, but you change, and you bring your knowledge as we get older. That changes too, and so I think there's, beyond the details which I've mentioned, there's also a way of reading text which is informed by the knowledge we may, in my case, which working for 15 years with the oral archives in the Gambia has also helped me to bring to that.
Okay, I know that Matthew Ayodele had a question for you, and I'm trying to see if I can allow him to talk. Maybe you can do that, Bolu, as I read this other question first. Thanks, Toby. I'm making my way through the book and really enjoying it. A question about writing. Very practically, how do you approach injecting larger arguments about capitalism, health, etc., into the writing of a microhistory? How do you ensure these larger structures do not get lost behind the texture and granularity of daily life that are so central to your narrative? And that's from Medina Thiem.
Thank you, Medina. Well, I hope I managed it. I mean, it's a difficult one. Yeah, I mean, I think I think it's something which in the book comes together more towards the end of it, actually. So the last two chapters, for instance, are on there's space and time, and then there's the one on healing, and both of those really relate so I showed briefly a slide around called with a book by Giordano Nani called The Colonization of Time. So that chapter is really quite fundamental to the book because it's looking at how ideas around time and the contrast between linearity of time and cyclical views of time were fundamentally connected to bearing in mind that this decade when the trial takes place is also the decade where Newton begins to develop his theory of gravity, where empire, its perception of the world, the metaphysical world, was becoming fun. And it's linked to science and the emergence of science. There was an intersection there which we cannot ignore. And at the same time, we see how in the trial and in the records which I'm drawing on there, that relationship is part of this kind of ideological and metaphysical struggle which I talk about, which is why the subtitle of the book is this question of the struggle over life, because that's very much what it is. And then the final chapter on healing then puts that in that context. So I would say what I try to do in the book is that the book starts with this kind of granularity of detail, and as it goes on, then in the second half of the book, we have those two concluding chapters. We have the chapter on enslavement and human trafficking. And then the chapter on work, which deals with the issue I just mentioned over wage labor. Those themes the granularity doesn't become overtaken with, but is in increasing dialogue with those themes in the second half of the book. So that's how I've tried to do it. You'll let me know how I got on.
And we have a question about expanding the project or perhaps moving in a new direction. If you could, how would you take the next step to expand the work that you've already done in this book?
Oh, that's a very good question. Quite a challenging one. It will, of course, depend on the kind of materials which I'm able to work with. I am working slowly on a project. So there are two trials I mentioned, two trials which are the main basis, empirical basis of the book. The one, Crispina Perez, which Filipe Ribeiro da Silva and I published in a scholar edition a few years ago. The other of Luis Rodriguez, we are slowly working on that. So that's, I think, at the moment, a project which I hope will bear some kind of fruit in the longer term. But I think, as we all know, this kind of work is slow. We don't quickly necessarily move on, have a lightning bolt idea and move on to the next thing. I think it's through presentations like this that will encourage me to do that. I can certainly say that. And I think that what I've been doing actually since I published this book, I'm finishing a short history of the continent, which I'm writing with Hassoun Cissé of the National Centre of Arts and Culture of the Gambia. So that's been a good change because I think that kind of change will help me then to move on to new projects.
Wonderful, thank you. And here we have one from Matthew Ayudele, and he is asking, first he says, fascinating work. If you could talk more about the book's broader intervention in African historical scholarship beyond the innovative sources your work has engaged, What does it do with Atlantic history, and what are the new questions you think it raises for scholars?
Hmm. I think in terms of Atlantic history, what it I think what it does is really crystallize, as I say, the way in which this period of the 17th century, which in A Fistful of Shells I argued these decades were quite central. I think it shows that in uh, in the amount of detail which I wasn't able to bring to A Fistful of Shells in case studies to show quite why this decade was pivotal. And it was pivotal because of this intersection between empire, science, and this struggle of how the world is seen. And it shows that how this was happening in one location. I think maybe the questions it's asking scholars of the Atlantic world and of the African past is, is this therefore something which could be considered in other locations, which could be taken further and also this idea of a struggle over the way the world is seen and what is important in it and where else, what other kinds of sources might scholars use to develop those ideas and what other locations may we be able to work with to do that and how might that struggle appear from different places in the continent in this century.
Thank you. And then this will be our last question. It's a two-part question. To what extent can translation retain the performative, contextual, and epistemic rather dimensions of orality? And how do you account for what is inevitably lost or reconfigured in your historical exposition? The second part is, how does your approach to translation help recover the nuances of orality in your sources, particularly in ways that resist the flattening effects of colonial archival systems and data-driven historical methods?
Well, again, a massive question. I think clearly no translation is perfect. And as I think to go back to the point I made before, I think a translation is never, the text plus the translator themselves also changes and brings the knowledge they have of the context in which a source is produced, or any text is produced, to how they try to render that in a different way. And so all I can say is that that's how I've tried to approach these texts through, 30 more years of knowledge which I have of the Senegambian region, and how that has influenced the way in which I read the text and how I then try to render it. In the edition which we published in 2021, the way in which we did try to do this was not to interrupt the flow of speech which is rendered in the text through modern forms of punctuation and orthography, and that's, I think, something which is quite loyal to how and faithful to how that was produced in an oral form. But obviously, in a broader sense, any rendering of speech into text is already a loss of some kind. So that's the world of text that we inhabit, which has become obviously dominant. That's something that we all have to engage with in one way or another.
Okay, thank you very much for this very insightful overview of the book and potential research projects for the future. We look forward to them. Thank you for
Yeah.
joining us to listen to Dr. Toby Green.
Thank you very much, everybody.
Thanks, Toby. That was great.
Okay.
Really appreciate it. And it's great to put a face to a name and to meet you for the first time.
Okay. Thanks, John. Okay. Thank
Okay.
you, everybody. Thanks,
Bye.
Robin.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.